Welcome to part 2 of my DIY epoxy river table build. If you haven't seen part 1, I recommend watching that before this one. However, if you just want to see the epoxy pour and everything after that, this is a great place to start. What you need for the actual epoxy pour. I use Epoxy liquid plastic 2-to-1 ratio. Do not use the 1-to-1 ratio. It was never intended to be used for these river tables. So make sure you get the 2-to-1 liquid plastic. And then dye, gloves, everything to keep you clean. I've used other epoxies when I started making these river tables, so you don't have to use Epoxy. It's just a lot easier, much better results. I've done the West system, which they say you can pour a 1/4 inch, but I was really limited to about 1/8 of an inch per pour. This Epoxy, under a little bit cooler conditions, you can do 2.5 inch pours. I'm going to do 1 inch pour since it is so hot right now. But I know guys that pour up to 3 inches with this Epoxy, which is so easy, especially if you're doing a color to get a consistent color through an entire pour. You just can't beat being able to do it in a single pour. I have a couple tips to make sure you get the exact color you're hoping to get when you're doing these epoxy pours. You see here I'm using trans tint. It's woodworking dye. Epoxy also makes dyes. Either one of them will work just fine. A little bit goes a long way, so do it 1 drop at a time. That way it's always easier to add more, then you obviously can't take any out. So give it a good mixing. This is also a great time to help mix your epoxy when you're mixing your color. I ended up doing 2 drops per liter, which is not very much, because I wanted a slightly transparent black. When the sun hits it, I wanted to be able to see through it. And what I've come up with to get my color just right is I take the depth of my table, and this one's going to be 2 inches, and I make a mark at 2 inches on this clear plastic cup. Don't use a white cup or a colored cup because it will always distort the color. What I do is I take a big dip of it out and look down in the cup, not across the cup. It's tempting to look across, but since your measurement is that 2 inches vertically, make sure you look down, and that way you'll get the exact color your table will be when finished. Because there's such a variation from a 3/4 inch table with a certain amount of epoxy as there would be a 2 inch table. A blue will look almost black if you go from 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches. This really is the fun part, and with Epoxy, the pour is really kind of foolproof. If you are using another kind of epoxy, do not just dump it in like this. You'll get a crazy amount of bubbles, but the nice thing about Epoxy, all the bubbles will pop themselves in about 24 hours. So there's also no need to use a propane torch. Again though, if you are using a different epoxy, this would definitely be a good time to pop these with a propane torch. Just go really light on that torch to make sure you don't overheat it. During your pour, continually check for small leaks. Check your level, make sure everything's looking good. If you have even a drip, it'll probably turn into a river by the time it is done leaking, so really be careful about this. And since it does take 72 hours to cure, about 48 hours before it's hard, I like to cover it to keep the dust and debris out. This is still a shop that I'm working in, so I have other projects going on. Depending on the temperature, between 24 and 48 hours, you'll be ready to do the second pour if necessary. Basically, when your fingernail can kind of dig in, but it's not super hard, is a good time because then it will really chemically fuse to that first layer. If you do wait until it's completely hard, it's not a big deal. You just want to scuff it up like we did the sides to give that epoxy something to adhere to. A Scotch-Brite pad or a 400 sandpaper is a good way to do that. And don't worry about the little micro scratches. They will just disappear when the epoxy is poured on. After at least 72 hours, sometimes I'll wait even longer to make sure it's nice and cured. You can take it out of the mold, and if you built your mold properly, it'll come apart this easy. Not every mold I've done has come apart this easy. It's had some hard lessons. That tape is really worth it here. I probably shouldn't be using the metal pry bars in this. There's little wood wedges you can use that are a little bit easier. And you'll see the epoxy seeped all the way under the slab, which was actually my plan to begin with. And the reason I did that is because I knew I was going to be bringing it to this large industrial planer, and I wanted a nice flat bottom to feed through. I did have a little bit more epoxy waste, but it's not too big a deal. Here's another method I've used if you don't want that epoxy to seep under. All you do is some blue painter's tape and some caulk. The painter's tape makes the caulk not stick to it or get in the grains, and then just clamp it down. And this works really well. And this is another method I may use again in the future. I tend to kind of experiment even now between methods as I make these tables. If you're a home shop guy like me, here's something worth looking into to see if there's a industrial shop in your town or near you that will let you rent out equipment. And what I do is I go up to a shop in downtown Portland called Creative Woodworking, and for 120 bucks an hour, $60 for a half hour with a half hour minimum, they let you use all the tools in the shop. They actually give you a guy to use it for you. And the planer here is the main reason I brought it in, to make sure I just got a good flat surface. If I didn't have access to this, I could use that router sled that I used early on in the video, but this is a really nice way to get it just dead flat, all ready for finish sanding. Also, while I was here, I decided to take it over to the sliding table saw, have them square it up for me, because I do have a half hour minimum, and that planer took all the material off so fast that I would save myself some time, but I could obviously do this with my circular saw back at my own shop. Good tip is I had to leave for a week, so I wrapped it up in plastic. This will prevent it from cupping or bowing while you are away. Moving on to the sanding, you don't need to actually go crazy with the sanding. I start at 100, 150, 220, then go to 320. Just make sure you get the big swirls out of that black epoxy. And another tip here is to add a pencil line there so you can make sure you don't miss any spots between grits. For finishing, you have a couple options. I've used quite a few different methods. Uh, for home shop, I'd recommend doing Odie's oil or Armasil, and I'll go over the pros and cons of those in just a second. First, though, this table I had a professional shop sprayed on a conversion varnish finish. It turned out really, really well, and that's the best finish I've found so far. I may end up going back to an Odie's oil, but for now, I really like what the shop can get me in a really nice satin finish, which I think is best for a coffee table. But I do think that for a home shop, Odie's oil is going to be best in that you won't have to worry about any dust particles getting in there. But the Armasil will seal the scratches a little bit better. So it's really your call. You'll have to work a little bit harder on the sanding with the Odie's oil, but it'll end up with a little bit nicer finish. And the Armasil, a little less sanding, but you'll have to worry about the dust particles that are always a challenge with these finishes. So it's kind of your call. I get my legs a few places, but I find myself more often than not going back to Etsy. And a couple reasons for this. One, it is nice to support the small local makers, but two, I really think they have the best stuff. You get some really creative guys, some really cool designs from basic U shapes to some kind of wild X-shaped legs. You can get brass, any type of powder coat. So I go to Etsy a lot. I think they have the best makers and actually pretty good prices. I was so excited when I discovered these easy lock threaded inserts. They give a really, really professional look. Instead of running lag bolts or something into your super nice tabletop, these the ones I like are zinc, and all you do is drill a hole, use a Allen head tool, and thread them in. And that way you can use these machine screws to assemble it, disassemble it any number of times, and they'll last forever. Because this table base we used on this river table was so unique, I had to come up with pretty much a one-off solution. And you'll see here what I did. I still used the threaded inserts so the clients can assemble and disassemble it if need be. And I used steel C-channel. And the only reason I put it at a diagonal angle like that is so it didn't cross the river, since it is a transparent epoxy. And it clicked in here really nice, really firm, and used the machine screws, tighten it up, and it is a very, very sturdy mount. And that is the project. I am finally done. Well, almost done. After I finish these tables, I like to get some really nice photographs for my website. So here's the photography studio I have set up in my garage. Just a white paper backdrop. The photos you'll see were actually with a black backdrop. And I used a method called light painting or painted light. There's a lot of tutorials on YouTube and online of ways you can do this. It's a really, really cool, really fun way to photograph these tables, especially if you don't have an unlimited budget for expensive photography lights. Okay, everyone, that is my video. If I left anything out, please let me know in the comments. Also, I'm pretty new to these YouTube videos, so let me know how I can make them better, make them easier to watch. If I jumped around too much, just let me know what you think. Really appreciate it, and please, if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks.